Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So grateful to be with you all, and really grateful to be on stage with friends, colleagues, luminaries, to talk about something so many of us are searching for desperately: hope. And hope is a funny thing. In our culture, in this society, we typically turn to hope when times get hard. We use it to sweep our difficulties under the rug, or pretend like they don't exist, or perhaps sugarcoat the stuff that's hard. And yet we also know that this kind of hope doesn't actually serve us, that it's too thin, that it crumbles, and the darkness just keeps coming. And our hope today, see what I did there? Our hope. Our hope today is to go a little deeper, to think about what hope can look like in a way that's more robust, in a way that's thicker, in a way that can endure when life gets really hard. When I was 18, the terrorist attacks of 9/11 happened, and I felt like the world had crashed all around us. As an American, it felt like, what do we do? People are attacking us. And I felt hopeless. And as a Sikh, with the racist backlash that followed, that felt hopeless to me too. That day, my mom picked us up from school on 9/11. My brothers and me, we went home, and we locked the doors, and the death threat started that afternoon. First by people calling our home, and then by people driving by. And it was a really intense period. It was dark. I felt despondent, and I wasn't really sure where to turn. And I'll tell you, a few days later, still haven't left the house because of the threats. I remember walking down the stairs of our home, and my father's looking out the front door, the window of the front door. And without even turning to look at me, he says, "Aren't we so lucky?" Mm. And I knew this was a trap, so I wasn't going to respond. But in my head, I'm thinking, what is he going to say? What could be lucky in this situation? And he goes on to say, "Haven't you noticed that our neighbors have been coming to give us food? Haven't you noticed that your teachers have been calling to check in on you, and so have your classmates and your teammates? Aren't we so lucky that we have so many people who care about us?" And this simple sentiment changed my life. Mm-hmm. It was a lesson in how do we embrace the difficulties of our world, the real hard stuff, the darkness, but also recognize the goodness. And recognize that they can live together, that they do coexist. You know, in my head, I was so focused on the negative, on the threats, on the survival. And it makes sense. They were legitimate threats. But I couldn't see the goodness that was already all around me. And I started to understand that this was a choice. And perhaps there was a practice around building hope. And so today, in our conversation, I'm hoping we can do something similar. As we're thinking about the difficulties of our world today, there are so many. Climate change, mental health crisis, mass shootings, war. I mean, it's all around us. It feels hard. It feels hopeless. And so what does it look like for us to build a hope that can endure? So that's where we are today, a minister, a rabbi, and a humanist chaplain, talking about what have we learned?
It sounds like we're about to walk into a bar. I'm sorry, it does.
And so what do we do in this conversation? We're going to explore these ideas of hope and what it looks like personally and collectively from the wisdom of our traditions. And so maybe, Rabbi Sharon, we can begin with you. What is it that you're finding difficulty with in life today? What are some challenges? Where is it hard to find hope? And where maybe are you finding it in unexpected ways or ways that might surprise you?
First, I am so moved by the story that you just shared, Simran, and grateful to your father for that wisdom. I think that I think we naturally move through waves of hope and despair. And I speak often about hope like the moon, the waxing and waning. And hope isn't a kind of constant, consistent presence, but sometimes you see it, you feel a little bit less, and then it becomes full-bodied again. But I think one of the things that contributes to a sense of despair, a lack of hope, a hopelessness, is when we feel isolated. So you have this instinct, which you could be you could be met in the grief and in the hopelessness by a loving friend or neighbor or partner. But if you're not, if you're isolated in your hopelessness, then it's very, very hard to move through it. And so I am very focused on this because I think we are, as we all know, living in a moment that's really defined by a crisis of alienation and social alienation and isolation and loneliness. And it's really destroying us. It's hurting our spirits and our bodies and our democracy. And so I'll just share with you just one story to kind of illustrate the way that I think companionship helps us navigate those darkest moments so that we can have, until a new dawn is ready to emerge, which is, my father died just before the Jewish holidays this past year. And it's really hard to be a pulpit rabbi and have your father die before the biggest days of the year. But I had this moment in the rush of grief and mourning in which we were at the graveside, burying my beloved father. And usually the family in a Jewish funeral will come forward first, and we place earth on the coffin. I encourage people to do it with our own hands rather than with shovels. There's something so powerful about the earth in your fingernails. And my family came forward and we placed the earth, and then usually the family pulls back to a tent, especially when it's 103 degrees out in Simi Valley like it was for us. And my mom didn't want to leave my dad's side. So she just wouldn't move away from the edge. And so we ran and got her a chair, and she just sat down right at the edge of the graveside. And then all of us, the kids and grandkids, just sat beside her right at the edge of the grave. And we were singing this beautiful, Hebrew songs, El Nora Alila, just singing this gentle song and crying. And then at some point I looked up and I saw this line of hundreds of people who had come out to the valley in the middle of the summer to bury my dad with their own hands. It completely took my breath away. I mean, friends I haven't seen in 10 years, people who used to work in my community who haven't been around for a decade. I just could not believe it. And I thought, oh, this is what it means to be met in the darkness and just have someone by your side until you're able to move through. So your father's recognition at that moment that there were people who were with you is what broke the isolation and created the space for hope to be reborn, even in an incredibly dark moment. And I actually think that's our superpower. I think that is one of the things that we can give to each other is our presence and our love, meeting somebody in the darkness, in the grief, in the despair, and just being by their side until the new dawn eventually emerges.
I love that. Nadia, how about you? Where are you struggling when it comes to hope, and how are you reconciling that?
I love how you framed it, or how your dad framed it, in terms of like, what information are you choosing to let in to draw your conclusions? Because we're inundated with a certain type of information constantly right now. And it's so easy for us to pull our conclusions from what we're exposed to. But something we were talking about this morning, like the human psyche wasn't really developed to be able to hold and respond to information about human suffering that goes on for every person all across the planet, every minute of the day. Our psyches were kind of developed to be able to hold and respond to the suffering that's right in front of us in our tribe or our foraging band or whatever it is. And finding compassion for myself when I realized that one of the reasons I might be buying stuff I don't need on Amazon and eating food that's not made out of food, and might be that overwhelm. And like finding compassion for myself by just thinking, I published a piece this morning about this. This is why I'm thinking about it. Having compassion for myself by thinking anthropologically about the fact that we human beings have been around for 300,000 years, and for 290,000 of those, we were hunter-gatherers. We were living collectively and moving our bodies outside, and like we sort of are adapted for a very different life than we're living. And so I guess this is all a way of me saying sometimes when I have a hard time finding hope, it's because I've placed my trust in things that aren't worthy of my trust. Meaning institutions or the Dow Jones or whatever it is. So it's always this opportunity, if I'm having a hard time finding hope, to go, what was I placing my trust in that maybe wasn't worthy of that trust? One of the sort of strategies that I have is to try and always think bigger and more historically, because when we're really myopic about our lives, it can lead to despair. But I think it's one of the reasons being a person of faith can be really powerful, is that I have like hundreds and thousands of years of stories and of other people's faith and their unwinding of that story in their own lives to rely on. It creates a sort of load-bearing structure for me in times of collapse. So not only can I sort of think, what am I placing my trust in? What information am I letting in? But also, I can rely on the faith of other people, the hope of other people. It doesn't always have to come from me. Because if I place my hope in my ability to be hopeful, then it doesn't work out for me. But I have to draw upon a deeper pool than just my limited resources in order to have what I need. Fortunately, that pool is unlimited. So.
Greg, how about you? As you're looking at the challenges of the world and some you're seeing firsthand, where are you seeing glimpses of hope?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just want to say that, it's really powerful to sit here and talk about these kinds of issues with, for example, I'm an atheist and a chaplain, right? The title is humanist chaplain, but I'm an atheist, and I've had like 20 plus years of a career working as clergy for and with my fellow atheists and agnostics, right? But there's a lot of atheistic, humanistic philosophy out there, but there aren't that many sort of formal communities, clergy, chaplains, that sort of thing. And so actually each of the three of you were individuals that I could look at for models, for inspiration, for, we disagree on the God thing, but wow, you teach me how to do some of the work that I do so much better. And I'm thankful for that, and I'm also mindful of the fact that, we're all sitting here talking about hope and hopelessness, and we are about to watch a Trump-Biden debate tonight. So, there's a certain extent to which we're here prophylactically, right? And I don't want to go on, but, I saw in Switzerland just a few days ago, a pristine mountainside collapsed like a waterfall. And, here we are in Aspen, right? So, I get hopeless all the time is the short version, but, I'll just say that when we were on campus at Harvard and MIT the past year, it was so hopeless to think of all these different, battles that needed to be fought and how one side couldn't talk to another. And as a humanist, it just sort of, I felt like I was looking for who gets in the middle and says, we're all human beings here. And it's not that I was able to solve the problem, but what gave me hope was reaching out, being part of it, and maybe being part of encouraging our campus rabbi and imam to talk to one another and build what they built, which was an amazing friendship. That gave me hope in truly dark times.
Rabbi Browse, I know you had an experience along these lines on the UCLA campus. Is that right? I remember.
Yeah. I mean, I will just acknowledge, I mean, it's been a really, really tough year. And so I, first of all, have a kid on a college campus that's really at the epicenter of a lot of this conflagration of the past year in the States. And it's been very tough to watch her have to navigate that as a Jew, and as a Jew who cares deeply about both her family in Israel and also human rights and Palestinian people, and who was raised in a house where we believe that the only way is a just future for Israelis and Palestinians, and that those things are not contradictory, but actually are necessities. But I was called to UCLA that on that terrible day when that sort of sparked a terrible week at UCLA, if you tracked it in the news. And I was called by a number of faculty friends of mine who said things are getting really bad. There was an encampment on the campus that the school did not want to remove the encampment, so there were counter-protesters who said, we're going to come and essentially like create enough tension that the encampment is removed. And by the time I got there, there were protesters and there were counter-protesters, and they were face-to-face and inches away from each other. It looked like a street brawl. I mean, and sometimes people throwing punches, sometimes just screaming at each other, this side, flags, shouting, bullhorns. And I found my way to the people in purple, who are the Standing Together people. If you haven't heard of them, it's worth knowing these folks. These are Israeli Jews and Palestinians who believe that the only future is a just future for both peoples. And they were there, and we pulled out of the crowd for a moment and connected with each other on strategy. And then we walked actually back to right in between where these two camps were. And we were literally pushing in between people because they were so nose to nose. And one of the people from this group, again, of Israeli Jews and Palestinians, one of them had a bullhorn, and he started chanting, "From Gaza to Tel Aviv, all children deserve to live." That's it. And we started saying it, like 20 of us in the midst of thousands of people screaming at each other. And I saw that to my right, in the ostensibly pro-Palestine camp, although I don't like those labels, in the protest side, they started clapping and joining the chant. And then on the other side, in the counter-protester side, they started clapping and joining the chant. And I want to say that it wasn't thousands, but it was like a couple dozen people on both sides. And it just occurred to me in that moment that we don't have the language for dreaming about and thinking about a hopeful future right now. We only see what's right in front of us, and we know the mottos, and we know the signs, and there's this kind of realm of false binary, false dichotomy. You're in this camp or you're in this camp. And what about the people who actually see the humanity in a human being? Can we understand that we all think that children deserve to live? And once people were handed that vision, that language, they're like, yeah, I want that, right? I mean, how can I not want that? And so you start to kind of lift your gaze and think about the possibility of a different future. And I'll just say one more thing really quickly, which is that this reminds me, there's a story in the Torah about when Moses goes up, when the Israelites on their way from Egypt to the Promised Land are attacked by Amalek, the worst enemy of Israel, because they attack the vulnerable. And they're fighting this terrible battle, and Moses goes up onto the mountainside, and he lifts his arms in the air. And when his arms are up, do you remember what happens? When his arms are up in the air, the people prevail down below. But he's human, and his arms start to sink because it's really hard to stand like this for too long. And as his arms go down, the people start to be defeated. And so Aaron and Hur need to go up there, and they're literally holding his arms up in the air. And so the rabbis ask, what's going on? Is it magic? Like when his hands are like this, they're victorious, and when his hands sink, they lose? And they say, like, no. When his hands were up, he lifted the people's gaze to something bigger than the street battle that they were in that moment, and gave them something to believe in, something to hope for. That's not an opioid. That's something to dream about and then work toward, which I think is the very essence of what hope is. And that's our business. That's our business.
The lift the gaze. That's exactly it. It's lifting the gaze from that myopic view and lifting your gaze off of your computer. It really is, because a lot of what's happening on the campuses is that human beings have this really potent need to preserve our self-regard, to think of ourselves as good. And instead of taking in information from our actual lives about who we are and if we're good, now we have people who are almost exclusively taking in information about themselves from influencers and from memes online. And so online they're being told, if you don't do this, then you don't care about that, right? So, and it keeps amping up and amping up. And some pretty bad actors are affecting those algorithms as well. The algorithmic overlords, it's very profitable for them. And so to lift your gaze from your self-regard being affected by stuff that you're reading online into the actual world, and maybe even bigger, into like a bigger story, like you're saying, is critical at this point, I think.
Yeah, well, I guess my question then would be, how do we do that, right? I think it's not it's not a profound statement for us to say we're so narrowly focused on ourselves and our own tribes that's creating all of this friction. That, you know, part of the mental health crisis is correlated to what's happening in big tech, right? So we're kind of able to see these problems and to say maybe if we were on our phones less, maybe we would be more connected with our families or our loved ones, and we'd be able to lift our gaze. But I think what we're struggling with as a society is, how do we do that? We don't know the answer to that as a culture, and I'm wondering if from your traditions, from your practices, from your philosophies, have you encountered anything that's worked in your communities? And what would you offer to people who are looking for some sort of solution? Greg, I wonder if you might lead us here.
Yeah, I mean, I love, Nadia, that you said lift the gaze from the computer. I would have had to jump in on that if you hadn't gotten there. So I think we're all thinking about it. And interesting, Sharon, that you mentioned the opioid piece, you know, that Moses' message in that story, very powerful story. I may think that Moses is a literary character, but it's a very powerful literary character for me. I have his action figure on my bookshelf.
I have an RBG. So.
Yes.
So I hope that wasn't insulting. I mean, I love Moses. So anyway, the opioid, it's not that Moses' message is the opioid, but the tech is in many ways, right? Like we're facing a world that has so much change. The climate change, the technological change, which is bewildering, the change in values and beliefs and the structures of communities, it's all too much. And it's really easy and short-term quite comforting, actually, to just put the head down. And I noticed this kind of a little earlier than most. This is kind of weird, but I wrote about this in 2008, 2009, before I even had an iPhone. I noticed as I was writing my first book, Good Without God, that I was addicted to my Palm Pilot Trio.
Oh, Lord.
And I went and I got addiction, like I went to recovery meetings and I talked about it. It was really weird back then. But now, then I wrote about tech addiction again in 2021 after this first year of the pandemic. And then, a couple years later, like Kashmir Hill and Chris Mims at the Times and the Wall Street Journal, respectively, wrote like a very similar piece because like everybody's tech addicted now, right? Here's the thing, though. You can't go cold turkey from the tech, most likely, right? I mean, if you were addicted to heroin, I would suggest cold turkey to you, right? If you were killing yourself with alcoholism, I would strongly suggest you consider cold turkey. But with tech, our students can't do that. So for my next book, I talked to eating disorder experts. Because, when you have an eating disorder, you can't afford to just give up food or water, And in fact, you can't even afford to have a negative relationship with it. You've got to actually like transform your way of engaging with the thing, with the food, and in this case, with tech. And so there's actually a real need to transform our sense of, all right, we've got tech and it's not easy, but there's more to it than just an addiction. We've got to. Yeah, I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
All right.
What would you say, Nadia, in terms of drawing from your tradition? We're thinking about how do we transform this thin sense of hope that doesn't really get us far enough, that crumbles around us, and how do we create something that is more enduring? Are there traditions, are there practices that you draw from Christianity?
I actually made a vow at my ordination. In the Lutheran ordination liturgy, you vow to not give people illusory hope. I thought that was amazing. I just describe it as like, I won't blow sunshine up your ass, basically. I'll be a straight shooter with you. But there's a text in our scripture that talks about hope, but it doesn't start with optimism. It actually starts with suffering. So Paul's writing about suffering, and he said suffering produces endurance, like the ability to live life when life is hard. And endurance produces character. And character produces hope, and hope doesn't disappoint. But I like those steps because they feel realistic to me. The relationship between suffering and endurance and character and hope. And then I feel like I can prick up my ears if someone's talking, because I feel like a lot of times we skip over the suffering part, or we go to hope because we think it's like a suffering avoidance technique. And it's not. It's like intricately related to suffering. So I find that hopeful. And also in my, so I'm part of what's called mainline Protestantism, right? Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Lutheran. And mainline Protestantism is not a growth industry. If you look at most Sundays and who is in the pews still in these churches, and you project them out 15 years, most of them aren't alive. So really, it is collapsing and it's dying. And so there's a lot of institutional anxiety. And I don't actually have any of that. And it's not because I think, well, as soon as we hire the right church consultant, then everyone's going to come back like it's 1962. It's not happening. The reason that I am not filled with despair about it is that the main thing will always be around. People will still gather, they'll still pray together, they'll still read scripture, you know what I mean? There's this really basic human, you don't need a building, you don't need a that will still happen. And to me, focusing on the main thing that actually can't be taken away if an institution crumbles, to me is hopeful. So I'm always looking at what cannot be hurt, what can't crumble. I actually believe no matter what we suffer, what we endure, there is a part of us, this imago Dei, that actually cannot be hurt. There is a part in us that is protected, and no matter what assault we experience, it can't touch that. So I think just thinking about what can't be harmed, what can't be taken away, feels hopeful to me.
And it perhaps attaching ourselves to that which endures rather than to the trappings or the identities that we commit ourselves to.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very interesting. Sharon, how about you? What is it that you draw from your tradition?
First of all, we called our community in Los Angeles, we call it Ikar, which means the very essence of the thing. What's really the heart? And right now, we're in the process of sort of figuring out how do you build the envelope to hold the love letter, right? Because you actually do need some kind of container or sacred space to hold the beautiful, powerful idea, like this campus that holds these beautiful and powerful ideas. So that's an interesting dialogue I'd love to have with you.
It's like the difference between the wrapping and the gift.
Yes, right? Yeah. As long as you know that the point is the love letter and not the envelope, right? So there's an ancient Jewish ritual that's been my North Star for the last 2 decades, and I literally fell in love with this ritual so much so that I just wrote a book about it. And the ritual is, in ancient times, Jews used to amass from all across the land and some in the diaspora, and they would go up to Jerusalem on the holiest of days. They would ascend, Jerusalem's a city on a hill. They would then ascend the steps of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and they would go through this beautiful arched entryway. and they would turn to the right and circle around the perimeter of the courtyard of this Temple Mount en masse, hundreds of thousands of people at once. And then they go out right where they came in, except for somebody with a broken heart. That person would go up to Jerusalem, go up the steps, and then they would turn to the left when everyone else turned to the right. And then this sacred encounter would occur between the people who are basically okay that day and the people who are not at all okay. And these people would look into the eyes of the person with a broken heart and say, Malach, tell me what happened to you. Tell me about your broken heart. And the person would answer saying, I just lost my father and I'm really sad and I don't have time to grieve. So that's another burden. Or they would say, I just found a lump. Or I'm really worried about my kid. And then the people going this way would give that person a blessing. They would say something like, may the one who dwells in this place hold you with love as you navigate this time. And then they'd keep going. And I realized after many years of study and pastoring to a community that the power of the ritual was that none of the parties involved want to be in that sacred moment. Because the people who are brokenhearted don't even want to show up in that place because literally they're walking in this direction and the whole world's walking in the other. And it's so isolating and alienating and scary. It's so vulnerable. And yet they go, because they have to trust that their hearts are going to be held with love there. And the people who are going in this direction, they're having the most meaningful spiritual experience of their lives. They do not want to peel away and go check in on a stranger with like red eyes. And yet they do, because that is the essence of being a human being, is actually seeing someone else in pain and not running away from them, which is why I was so moved at my father's funeral to see all those people who went all that way just to not run away from me when I was hurting. And I actually feel that in this time, this is our core calling, which is to actually encounter each other's humanity without running away, especially when it gets hard, especially when we're in pain, especially when we've experienced trauma and loss, and when we're fearful and uncertain about the future. And part of the power of this ritual is that the second example of people who go to the left is not just the brokenhearted, but also the ostracized, people who've hurt others in the community. And they too end up in that sacred space. And they too walk in the direction of the brokenhearted. And they are also met with curiosity. Tell me what you see from your vantage point. Why does your heart hurt? Tell me. Imagine if we approached the people that are screaming at us at the protest and said, I want to understand your pain and I want to tell you about mine. And then they share and we respond with a loving blessing. May you be held with love. May you not be alone. That pain sounds real. I hope you feel held with love. So that, I think, would transform our politics. It would transform our communities. And because my husband is like, is here, and thank you, and I would say this even if you weren't, when I wrote so deeply about this, and he's like, you got to make it practical for people. So how are we supposed to live that ritual in our lives? And this is to answer your question about translating the ancient ritual from the tradition into today. We don't know our neighbors. We don't know how to talk to each other. And there was a study that came out in 2019 that terrified me pre-COVID. It said that 1/3 of all Americans do not have one person in their, 1/3 of all Americans do not know the names of their next door neighbors. The person living to their right or to the left, they don't know their names. I'm sure everyone here knows the names of both your next door neighbors to the right and left, but most Americans do not. And that 20% of Americans don't have one single confidant in the world. So the practical application of this ancient ritual is I started to go for a run in my neighborhood every single morning. And it's a slow run because I can't do a fast run. And so what I do is I greet every single person I see on the way. And the people I don't know, I introduce myself to. And over the course of the last couple of years, I have transformed my relationship with my neighborhood. And I have a different sense of who's around me now and who's in need and who's in pain and who's celebrating. And this is actually something extremely simple that everybody can do and that changes us. And it changes us not only as individuals, but it changes us as a collective. Right? And it could actually change our society. Our democracy could be changed if we actually learned how to talk to each other, look at each other, not run away from each other's pain, not retreat when things get hard, but instead step closer to each other and say, what role can I play in deepening the understanding here? And the keys are compassion and curiosity.
Totally, I agree. Yeah.
Rebecca, I wonder what we might draw. In a few moments, I'll invite questions from the audience, but one more for you, Greg, and I'm wondering about what we might draw from humanist philosophy. I'm reflecting on what Sharon and Nadia have shared, and it sounds like part of the through line here is the ability to connect with people, and in a society that's so polarized, where there's a reason we don't talk to our neighbors. We don't want them to judge us. We don't want to bother them, right? It's so hard to talk to people. How do we begin breaking that down? And I wonder if in humanist philosophy, so I'm thinking about some of what I've read from you and some of what my tradition teaches me, that feels very countercultural, right? The culture here tells us, start with what's different about you, right? Like, I see your tattoos and I'm judging you for those, and I hear that you're Jewish and I'm judging you for that, and you're wearing a jean jacket, so I'm judging you, right? Like, we're judging people constantly, and that's how we're taught to think about one another. And so I'm just thinking about my tradition that says start from somewhere else, and what I've read from you that says start from somewhere else. So where would you like for us to begin?
Yeah, I think this is so important, and it's particularly important when we're living in what I would call a tech culture. This is a tech culture now. I just wrote this book where I'm arguing that although we've heard from incredibly important and necessary religious voices, and religion is not going anywhere, and nor should it, I would say that the largest religion and the most powerful religion in the world today is tech. And, and I don't have time to get into, making the case to you and convincing you, am I being literal, or is it the most annoying metaphor you ever heard in your life? Yes. But, the tech culture that we're living in desperately needs to hear these messages of human connection. And, I'll say it this way, like, humanists, we have all of human and psychology, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, and just decency to draw on. And so, it's a wide world out there, and you'll see some of it in the Aspen Institute library just out the door. But let's focus for a minute on the messages that you've heard from my religious colleagues now. These are such important messages that, if I'm sitting in a room of like AI leaders or designers or tech leaders who are much more likely to be an atheist like me, much more. I want them to listen to Sharon and to Nadia and to Simran. Please go and read their books, sit with them, sit with people like them, sit in their communities, and think about really deeply understanding human connection, one person to another, unconditional love, whether it's secular or religious, because you just don't have that message in the hyper-competitive, hyper-focused on individual excellence, individual winning, individual genius, individual taking over the world that we have been taken over by in this tech religion. So thank you, and I hope we can have more dialogues like this. That's got to be part of the answer.
One last question, and this is a surprise question.
Oh, gosh.
What's your hope? What's your hope for the world, for your family, for the people in this room? What are you hoping for right now? Surprise. Sharon, maybe we can begin with you.
Core to my faith is the idea that all human beings are created in God's own image, which means that every single person has infinite worth. And every person is equal, and every person is unique. And that vision is like a joke in our world today. I mean, if we really believed that, we would not let anyone go to sleep on the street at night. We wouldn't stand for war. We wouldn't stand for racism. We wouldn't stand for such profound income inequality. We would be fighting as hard as we can for this planet to have a future. But that vision stands, and it's actually a part of so many of our traditions, and I think humanists resonate to that vision too, without the in God's image part. And so my hope is that this time of rupture and crisis, the earthquake we're living through right now, this moral earthquake, reminds us of what matters most and helps us find our way to build a society that actually honors the image of God in every single human being. I know it's possible. We just have to want it.
Greg?
I want people to be able to view not only others, but actually themselves with a sense of unconditional love. And I'll just say, I struggled with that. I went to theological schools, and I was told that all the time by religious leaders, and it didn't make any sense to me for the longest time. And then my son was born. And for the first time in my entire life of obsession with, being good and being great, I saw this little being, and I thought, I don't care what you ever do, anything you would ever accomplish or not, I'm going to love you for the rest of our lives just because you exist. And I try to tell my students to look at the world that way, students at Harvard and MIT. And one student recently said to me, Greg, I'm sorry, I respect where you're coming from, but that's laughable. And that's the culture at a Harvard or an MIT, and maybe sometimes at an Aspen too. So it might feel laughable, but just try to give yourself the love, not for anything you'll ever accomplish, but because you exist and you deserve love.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Nadia?
I was asked this question at a college I was speaking at, what's your hope for the future? And at first I said, I hope I could get through a yoga class without getting angry, but then I moved on to, my hope is that my view of myself and others in the world is more informed by my actual human life than it is by stuff I read online. And I hope that for other people as well. And just to be, to have more of an understanding of what are the, I think the best gifts of God are everywhere and ubiquitous and often just small. And so I think my hope is that we can just reclaim what it means to be deeply human, those things that can't be taken away, and have those be more and more a part of our lives, and to try and cleanse some of the despair that inevitably comes from my view of myself and others in the world being totally defined by what I see on the internet.
Thank you. Well, we have some time. I'd like to invite some questions, if there are any. You can kindly raise your hands or your hand, and we will come to you with a mic. I see one back this way. Thank you. Just back here.
Hi, thank you. Given all the distrust that people have in each other, given all the conflicts, again, I'm a Jew, but I have Palestinian friends. I'm Ukrainian, but I live in Moscow. Would you say that religion is going to be the next wave of interest for people to save themselves from this alienation from each other?
Good question.
Religion has a really great track record in doing the opposite. And
Now you see why I love Nadia.
and it has a really great track record in doing exactly that. And so again, it's what lens are we going to use? What data are we going to let in to define that? So I do think that I agree with Greg that I would really love for those 12 men who are the head of the big tech companies who are our overlords now and get to decide our future as a planet, that I hope that they have, I don't think based on what I saw last night, they might be high in emotional intelligence. And so I would hope that they have ethicists and theologians at the table as they're making decisions moving forward. So because religion has been asking big questions about what it means to be human and what is the good and what does community mean and what is forgiveness and the big questions that matter most. We have a track record for asking those for thousands of years. So I don't know, maybe it's hubris, there might be some wisdom available.
I think something interesting that connects tech and religion is that they can both be used for good and for evil. And so, I mean, tech is these are just tools. And what we heard yesterday is that, the hope in creating these tools is that they're used to bring people together and to advance science and technology and medicine. And we all have I think there's no doubt how these tools have and will continue to do great harm to our society. And religion's the same. It's in the hands of the interpreter. And this is why I think it's so imperative that especially people whose voices have been absent from our tradition in the past, meaning the people who spoke, but their words weren't deemed important enough to be written down in the black letters on the scroll. I think that it's essential that the people who read our traditions and see a call to human dignity, to justice, to love, to forgiveness, that those voices become amplified in the public space, because they are as much a natural outgrowth of our traditions as the voices that are the dominant ones in the public space, which are voices for exclusion, violence, regressive politics, et cetera. And so I agree with you. I mean, tech and religion can be used to justify good or evil. It's our responsibility to make sure that it's used for the good.
Yeah, thank you. As we come to the next question back this way, I'll just add a note that says, these are tools and they can be used in different ways, and we've seen them used in different ways. And this is why it becomes so important for us to be clear-eyed about what we mean by hope, right? It's not about sort of silver lining and saying everything will be fine. It's being honest about, hey, this is what the world is, this is how humans are, and we need to be thoughtful about how we're engaging all this, right? Yeah, please, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and talking about this. I really needed it. I'm hoping that any or all of you can talk about the youth aspect of all the things that you mentioned. You talked about how, in the actual space of the church, you're seeing a much older generation. And I work with children. I'm just wondering if there's anything that we can do to get the youth hooked on humanity. And, because the things that you've talked about are really speaking, I think, to most of us in here. And I only see a couple of faces that are close to the age of the people that I work with. So how do we bring this beautiful intention to the schools and to children in our homes?
TikTok, I think, is really TikTok. Is that how we do it?
I mean, young people can't afford to be here at the Aspen Institute, by and large. I mean, with notable exceptions, of course, and scholarships provided and all of that good stuff. But
I mean, in terms of coming to you.
Yeah, and also, I also have to be very mindful of the fact that I work at and have devoted my life to working at institutions where too many young people can't afford to get there either. And even though they give scholarships too. The institutions that run our world make it vanishingly difficult for most young people to have access to the things that currently run our society: money, power, access, etc. But I actually think that there are a tremendous number of young people now who are willing to put aside overworking themselves and achieving any possible achievement to be in solidarity with one another and to care about one another and to love one another in the face of tremendous change and instability. I actually think that they're very inspiring. I learn from my students all the time. That's a hopeful message, I think.
The thing is, the kids have the same spiritual needs that the adults do. We just talk about it in a different language. And so I think that need to be seen in our joy and in our pain that many of us can identify with. I mean, I'm sure if I asked right now, think of a moment when you were broken by the world, right? You got that terrible phone call and you just felt broken by the world. And who came to your side and who was not there, who should have been there? Like, we can all draw upon those experiences to just remind ourselves of how critical it is to be seen by someone in our hour of need. So the kids have the same thing. I mean, my teenage kids, They need their best friend to call them when they're in pain, to intuit their pain and show up for them. And they know that it's their responsibility to do the same. So I feel like part of this is recognizing and honoring that kids have active spiritual lives too, and that they also need and yearn for a kind of they need to be met in their vulnerability. They need to be validated in their pain, and they need to be challenged. And we built our community in 2004, and I mean, for the first 10 years, almost everyone in the room was under 40, which was kind of shocking. It was like the people who aren't supposed to go to synagogue were coming every week. And people would ask us, like, what'd you do? Why are they coming? Everywhere's graying. And, by the way, I respect graying now as a, and the thing was, we asked a lot of people. We raised the bar and we said, you're here, this is what that means. Somebody just died, you go show up at the Shiva. You go to the house of mourning. This person just is taking the bar, you drive out to the hotel in Pasadena and bring this basket of chocolate and magazines. Like, we asked our people to do something for each other, and they responded to that. Like, they wanted to know that it mattered, that they were there, and that they would also be met with love on the other side. And so I think it's about understanding that they need the same things that we as adults need, but translating it into a language that actually speaks to this generation, and maybe doing that on TikTok would help.
No, I had the exact same experience. I started a church called House for All Sinners and Saints, and it was overwhelmingly young, and compared to other churches especially. And they were like, "How can we get young people? What are you doing?" And everyone wanted the recipe, and it was the same. We were like anti-excellence, pro-participation. So, and there was just, like you said, a low bar to entry, and everyone who showed up was given meaningful work to do. We were in the round. We just democratized the space, and that was really meaningful. And so there was a way in which they weren't just tokenized or fed information or fed theology. They were actively participating, and I felt like that was key.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Nadia, Sharon, Greg. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Simran.
Thank you.
Thank you.